In this lesson, we're going to look at carboxylic acids and esters and what their structure is and how we can name them and draw them. So we'll start with the carboxylic acids. So this is a type of organic compound that contains a carboxyl group, which is a combination of a carbonyl group and a hydroxyl group. The carboxyl group is located at the end of the carbon chain in a carboxylic acid. So this is the general formula where R represents a hydrocarbon chain, or it could just also be a hydrogen when it's only a single carbon carboxylic acid. So here's an example of carboxylic acid. As you can see, we have the carbonyl group, the hydroxyl group, and then together those make a carboxyl group, which is what you're looking for when you are looking for carboxylic acids. So how do we name carboxylic acids? So we name them by changing the ending of the parent alkane to anoic acid. And since by definition that carboxyl group has to be at the end of a carbon chain, we don't need to have any numbers in the name to indicate its location. So here's that example. So we count the number of carbons. There are 3, which means that the parent alkane would be propane. So we would call this propanoic acid. So how do we draw carboxylic acids? So you're going to start by creating a carbon backbone of the appropriate length, and then add the carboxyl group to usually the last carbon, but if you like, you can put it on the first one. And then fill in the rest of the bonds with hydrogen, making sure every carbon has a total of 4 bonds. So here's an example, hexanoic acid. So the hex tells us that this is going to have 6 carbons. So we create the 6 carbon chain, and then we're going to add the carboxyl group, which involves a double bonded oxygen and a hydroxyl group, so a single bond to an OH. And then we're just going to fill in all those H's. We can also write these as a condensed structural formula. So here you see, so it's CH3, CH2, 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 and the carboxyl group just gets written as COOH. And the molecular formula for hexanoic acid would be C6H12O2. So moving on to esters. So an ester is an organic compound that contains a carbonyl group, which is single bonded to an oxygen atom within a hydrocarbon chain. So this is the general formula for an ester. So it's similar to the carboxylic acid, except that hydrogen in the hydroxyl group has been replaced by a hydrocarbon chain. So here's an example. You can see the carbonyl group there in the middle, which is single bonded to an oxygen, and then the oxygen is then bonded to a carbon, and then there might be a longer chain attached to that. Esters are formed when a carboxylic acid reacts with an alcohol in what's called an esterification reaction. And during this type of reaction, water is also produced. So esterifications are an example of a condensation reaction, which is a reaction that produces a larger molecule at the same time as it releases water. So here is the general formula for a esterification reaction. So you've got a carboxylic acid reacting with an alcohol, and then water is removed, 2 H's and an O, and then they join together to create the ester and water. An esterification reaction can also be reversed to produce the carboxylic acid and alcohol components of the ester. So this would break down the ester. And this is a hydrolysis reaction, which is a type of reaction that involves the breaking of a bond in a larger molecule by adding water. So we take the ester, add water, it breaks apart into the carboxylic acid and the alcohol that it's made of. So how do we name esters? So the name of an ester has two parts. The first part comes from the alcohol, and the second part from the carboxylic acid. The alcohol is named as an alkyl group. So you figure out the name of the parent alkane and then change the ending to YL. And then you add the acid name, but you change the ending from anoic acid to anoate. So let's look at an example. So here's our example. So we look at the alcohol, which is at this end of the molecule. So it has two carbons, which means its parent alkane is ethane. And so the name in the ester name, this is going to be ethyl. So the first part of the ester name is going to be ethyl. Then we look at the carboxylic acid part of the ester. It has 4 carbons. So the acid name would have been butanoic acid. So we're going to change the ending of that to butanoate. So that's the second part of the name. So then you put those two together, and this ester would be called ethyl butanoate. So how do we draw an ester? So you want to start by creating a carbon backbone of the appropriate length for the acid portion. Then you add the carbonyl group, the double bonded oxygen, and add that single bonded oxygen to the last carbon. Then you're going to add the appropriate number of carbons to the single bonded oxygen as indicated by the alkyl group name. Then fill in the rest of the bonds with H so that each carbon has a total of 4 bonds. So we'll look at the example of methyl propanoate. So the acid portion, the propanoate part, so prop tells us that this has 3 carbons. So we would create that carbon backbone. Then we're going to add the double bonded oxygen and the single bonded oxygen. And then the alkyl group is methyl. So that tells us that's 1 carbon attached to that oxygen. And then we're going to add in all the hydrogens. And you can also write this as a condensed structural formula. So CH3, CH2, and then the ester group just becomes COO, and then the last portion, CH3. And so the molecular formula for the ester is C4H8O2. So that is how you can name and draw carboxylic acids and esters.